Oy vey! I've been going crazy here. We've got this camera system that allows us to stream to Facebook and YouTube simultaneously, and it works pretty well almost every day. Today it signed me out of everything. I couldn't get it back going. I apologize. We're about 20 minutes late, but let's light up the darkness. All right, we'll keep this moving. Do this tomorrow. And it's Elul, so we'll do a quick shofar blast. And welcome everybody who's tuning in. Melissa, thank you for being patient. Everybody, thank you for being patient. Stephen in New Hampshire, John in Maine, Pauline in Arkansas, Hannah in New York, Patrice in Utah, Carrie in Michigan, James in Indianapolis, Paul in the Great Northwest, Renee in Indiana, Judy in Oregon, Paula in Chicago. Ryan says, finally, I'm on time. Went on 20 minutes late. Lucy in Minnesota, Susan in Cali, Mark in Maryland, Carrie in Santa Clarita. Carrie says, shalom everyone. Stanley in Georgia, Zach in Washington State, Guy in Dayton, Benjamin in New Jersey, Portia in Alabama. It looks like Sharon in New Jersey. Kevin has got a gift, jumping for joy. PK in Colorado. Guy says, great to have you live anytime. Thank you, Guy. Joseph in Massachusetts, Joyce in Florida, Judy likes the shofar blast, David in New Mexico, Tom in PA. Great. Christo in Lubbock, Kevin says Kevin has got a smile. Christo says no need to apologize. Life happens. Amen. And Seraphim in Sacramento. All right, let me get my little monitor phone propped up. This is how I do it. I play the music from this through the speaker. This phone, I monitor the Mevo camera. All right. Where are we holding? This is page 43 here in Tractate Sukkah, the 7th volume of the Talmud. These are the Laws of Sukkot. This tractate has 5 chapters. We are in chapter 4. Yesterday, we read Mishna number 1 of chapter 4 and left it at that. It was rather lengthy for a Mishnah, but basically we're talking about how the Lulav and Esrog and the willow branch, which is also taken separate. It's one of the 4 species, but there's also a different ritual that's done only with willow branches. And basically how these intersect, these traditions of taking the 4 species, how it intersects with Shabbos, what happens when it's Shabbos during Sukkot, what happens when the first day of Sukkot, which is the full-fledged festival day, falls on Shabbos, how we differentiate between when the temple was standing and after the temple was destroyed, and we'll be differentiating between how Sukkot is observed in the land of Israel and outside the land of Israel. I won't reread that whole Mishnah, but I will read this halacha, this law, pertaining to the law of taking the lulav on Shabbos. Why do we say taking the lulav? Because the Torah commands you shall take the 4 species. And when we make the bracha, the blessing, we normally think of waving the lulav. When we pick up those four species, right? The branch of the date palm, the branch of the willow, the branch of the myrtle tree, and the yellow fruit known as an esrog or a citron in English. Those are the 4 species. And having picked them up, we will wave them in 6 directions, right? East usually first because toward Jerusalem, then south, west, north, up and down, which signifies, that God's, God is everywhere. God is everywhere, and His blessings come from everywhere. God rules over everywhere, and we thank God from every direction. But when we say the blessing, it's not actually over waving the 4 species. It's literally just picking them up and holding them together. And so that's why it's on the tilat lulav, right? On the tilas lulav. No. I just don't have the bracha on the tip of my tongue. Somebody will put it in the comments for me. What is the bracha again? Isn't it on the tilas lulav? But I'm just forgetting what the verb is in Hebrew. But the point is, what we're saying is, blessed are you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who has sanctified us with His commandments and commanded us to take the lulav. And that's why we have that interesting issue that as soon as we've picked it up, we've fulfilled our obligation. We have done the mitzvah. We performed the mitzvah. But we want to say the blessing while we're actually holding it, but before we perform the mitzvah. And that's why people will turn the esrog upside down, the fruit upside down. So we haven't really done the full-fledged taking of it, but it's in our hand. So we've definitely designated these 4 species that are in hand. Then we say the blessing, then we turn the fruit right side up. So we're really performing it. Okay, so with respect to taking the lulav on Shabbos, when the temple was standing, that's going to be as distinguished from later when the temple was destroyed. So when the temple stood, if the first day of Sukkot coincided with Shabbos, the lulav was taken on Shabbos in the land of Israel and anywhere else that people knew for certain which day was established as the first day of the month, and therefore which day was the festival. Recall that for much of Jewish history, right, when the Torah was given, and for the next, 1300 years, maybe more, 1700 years before the calendar was fixed, during those many centuries in the beginning, a new month only began when witnesses saw that faint sliver of the new and waxing moon, came before the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem, testified what they saw, and then the Sanhedrin declared, okay, the new month has begun. They knew approximately which night it was. So if the witnesses didn't come, or if they didn't see that sliver of the moon, they would add an additional day to the previous month. And instead of being a 29-day month, it became a 30-day month. If they saw that sliver of the moon, they said, okay, the new month has begun. Then they would send word out from Jerusalem. At one point in history, they did it with signal fires on the mountaintops. At another point, they did it with messengers. We've talked about that at other times. But they didn't have the internet. They didn't have telephones. They didn't have telegraph lines. So it took time for the word to get out past Jerusalem that the new month had begun. And the further away you were from Jerusalem, the longer it took. It could take weeks for the far-flung Jewish communities to find out when the month had actually begun. Therefore, they had uncertainty whether the month had begun or not, and thus, for later dates in the month, like Sukkot, which begins on the 15th day of the month, on the 15th day from when? They didn't know when the month had started. And this is why, even to this day, and now the calendar at some point, I think in the 4th century, became fixed permanently according to, astronomical movements of the stars, the planets, etc., and the moon. And now we know exactly when all the Hebrew dates are going to come out. So there is no more uncertainty. Nevertheless, the calendar remains to this day that for all other festivals than Rosh Hashanah is a 2-day holiday in Israel as well as outside of Israel. But for example, Sukkot in Israel, the first day is a full-fledged festival. Outside of Israel, the first 2 days are a full-fledged festival day. Likewise with the first 2 days of Passover and the last 2 days of Passover. Outside of Israel, 2 days because of that uncertainty with respect to the calendar. Okay, so what is the law now about taking the Lulav on Shabbos? So, when the temple stood, if the first day of Sukkot coincided with Shabbos, the Lulav was taken on Shabbos in Israel and anywhere else that people knew for certain which day had been established as the first day of the month, and therefore which day was the festival day. In distant places, they did not know for certain which day was the festival due to the uncertainty that they did, and due to this uncertainty, they did not take the Lulav on Shabbos. It is a Torah commandment to take the Lulav on the first day of the festival. Therefore, it's going to override even the prohibitions of Shabbos. Now, you can pick something up on Shabbos, but there's other issues that people might come to carry the Lulav through the public domain, which is prohibited on Shabbos. So the sages decreed that they would only take the Lulav on Shabbos when Shabbos coincided with the first day of the festival, since taking it on the first day is a Torah commandment. We take up the Lulav all the other days of Sukkot, but that's by rabbinic ordinance, not by Torah commandment, and therefore it doesn't override Shabbos. When they weren't sure whether it was the first day of the festival or not, they wouldn't override Shabbos. And that's why in those distant communities, they would not take the Lulav up on Shabbos. Eventually that law changed, and we don't take the Lulav on Shabbos anywhere. Not in Israel, not outside of Israel, even though there is no longer any uncertainty with respect to the calendar, since it was fixed for all time. The Lulav was not taken on Shabbos during the intermediate days of the festival. Following the destruction of the temple, the sages prohibited taking the Lulav on Shabbos even inside the land of Israel, and even during the time when the month continued to be sanctified by means of eyewitnesses. So there still was that uncertainty. The calendar had not yet been fixed. Nevertheless, after the destruction of the temple, the sages prohibited taking the Lulav on Shabbos, even in Israel, and even during the time when the month continued to be sanctified by means of eyewitnesses. Why? In order to avoid distinguishing between Jewish communities, between different Jewish communities, and saying that we're not going to have it that we still do have 2 festival days outside of Israel and 1 festival day inside of Israel. So there are distinctions between Jewish communities. Nevertheless, those festival days are observed in the same way, and they didn't want them to be observed in different ways other than the doubling of the first festival day when comparing outside of Israel to inside of Israel. All right, that's the law. Now we proceed to the Gemara, the commentary on the Mishna that we read at the end of class yesterday. Apropos the prohibition against taking a Lulav on Shabbos, the Gemara asks, why is this prohibited? After all, taking the Lulav is merely moving the object, and it is prohibited due to the rabbinic prohibition of set aside, muktzah. Right, so something that doesn't have a use, a necessary use on Shabbos is muktzah. Like a hammer is muktzah because it's normally used for work. If we're not taking the Lulav on Shabbos, then it would be muktzah because it doesn't have a use on Shabbos. It's an object that's not going to be used on Shabbos. But here they're saying, well, wait a minute. Is it going to be prohibited because of muktzah? I guess, for example, we talked about that women are not obligated in the commandment of lulav because it's a time-bound positive commandment. So you might think that it is muktzah for them, but we learned in the Mishnah that it is not. Now the Gemara continues. Why is this prohibited? After all, taking the lulav is merely moving the object, and it is prohibited due to the rabbinic prohibition of set aside. Since the mitzvah to take the lulav is a mitzvah, a commandment by Torah law, let it override this relatively minor Shabbos prohibition. Rabbah said, this prohibition is a decree lest one take the lulav in his hand and go to an expert to learn how to wave the lulav or how to recite the blessing. In other words, they said you can't take it on Shabbos. Once they made that decree that you can't take it on Shabbos, then they further decreed that you can't touch it on Shabbos. But it only became prohibited to do on Shabbos because they were concerned that you might come to carry it in the public domain. Now, originally they would carry it to the synagogue, and they said, well, you can't carry it to synagogue. You should put it in the synagogue on Friday afternoon because you can't carry on Shabbos. So, but then and everyone knew that. But then there was still a concern that, well, they might forget that, but they might think, oh, wait a minute, I'm not sure my lulav is kosher, it's not proper, or I forgot how to say the blessing. And without thinking about it, they might pick it up and go talk to somebody who's an expert, and then they'll come to carry it in the public domain. So again, they said, don't even touch it. Don't even touch it on Shabbos. And that is the reason for the prohibition against sounding the shofar on Shabbos. And that is the reason for the prohibition against reading the scroll of Esther when Purim coincides with Shabbos, right? So when Rosh Hashanah falls on Shabbos, one of the 2 days is on Shabbos, we don't blow the shofar. When Yom Kippur falls on Shabbos, we don't blow the shofar. We'll blow the shofar at the end when it's not Shabbos anymore. But you don't blow the shofar on Shabbos. Why? Because you might come to carry it in the public domain, and then you would have violated Shabbos. And the Gemara asks, if so, on the first day of Sukkot, or Sukkot, that coincides with Shabbos, also one should not take the lulav due to this concern. And the Gemara answers, with regard to the first day, the sages instituted that one should pick up the 4 species inside his house. Since the sages already prohibited one from taking the lulav out of the house, he will remember that it is prohibited and he will not come to take it elsewhere in order to consult with an expert and to learn how to wave it or to recite the blessing. And the Gemara asks, well, this works out well after the ordinance that one takes the lulav inside his house was instituted. However, earlier in history, prior to introducing that rabbinic ordinance, what is there to say in explaining why it is permitted to take the lulav on the first day? Rather, the Gemara rejects the previous explanation and explains the distinction differently. On the first day of the festival, when the commandment of taking the lulav, even in the outlying areas and not just in the temple, is in effect by Torah law, the sages did not issue a decree to prohibit taking the lulav on the first day, and they permitted the mitzvah to be performed even in the outlying areas. However, with regard to these other days of Sukkot, when the commandment of taking the lulav is not in effect by Torah law, in other words, the intermediate days of Sukkot, the Torah says on the first day of the festival you shall take the 4 species. The rabbi said we're going to do that every day of the festival, but it's not a Torah commandment. And so, when the mitzvah of taking the lulav is not in effect by Torah law in the outlying areas, and the lulav is taken there only to commemorate the practice in the temple, the sages issued a decree to prohibit taking the lulav on the other day. So what we're learning here is why did they say that when the first day isn't Shabbos, so Shabbos falls sometime during that week of Sukkot, why did they entirely prohibit even touching the lulav? And it's because of this fence around the Torah to make sure that you wouldn't come to mess with it, right? To take it, to carry it, to violate Shabbos in that way. And the Gemara asks, if it is so that the mitzvah, the commandment, on the first day is a mitzvah by Torah law, even in the outlying areas as opposed to in the temple, today too, one should take the lulav on the first day of Sukkot that coincides with Shabbos. And the Gemara answers, we do not know when precisely the establishment of the month was determined by the court. We're not sure which day is the first day of the festival because, if we're far away from Jerusalem, we don't know when they started the month, as this was done in ancient times. Therefore, it is possible that the day observed as the first day of Sukkot is not Sukkot at all. Certainly, one does not violate the rabbinic decree to fulfill a mitzvah that is not definitely a mitzvah by Torah law. And the Gemara asks, if so, with regard to the people of the land of Israel itself, who sanctified the month based on eyewitness testimony, and they know when precisely the month was established as beginning, when the court determined that. So let them override Shabbos for the mitzvah of Lulav on the first day of Sukkot, even today. So you might think, well, maybe in Israel there should be a distinction and they would take the Lulav on Shabbos. And the Gemara answers, yes, it is indeed so. And that is their practice, as it was taught in the one Mishna. On the first day of the festival that occurs on Shabbos, all the people will bring their lulavim to the Temple Mount on Friday. And we learned in a different Mishnah, they bring their lulavim to the synagogue. Learn from the change in the formulation from one Mishnah to another, that here where the Mishnah says they bring their lulavim to the Temple Mount on Friday afternoon before Shabbos, it is referring to when the temple is in existence. And there, where the Mishnah says that they bring their lulavim to the synagogue, it is referring to when the temple is not in existence and before they prohibited taking the lulav on Shabbos in all areas, right? That law changed later. New topic. The Gemara asks, from where do we derive that by Torah law, the mitzvah of lulav on the first day is in effect even in the outlying areas? And the Gemara answers, as it was taught in a Baraisa, and Leviticus 23:40, and you shall take for yourselves on the first day the fruit of a beautiful tree, branches of a date palm, and boughs of a dense-leaved tree, and willows of the brooks, right? The myrtle tree, the willow tree, the date palm branch, and the fruit of the beautiful tree, that is the esrog. And you shall rejoice before the Lord your God 7 days. So that's the complete commandment there of the lulav and esrog, Leviticus 23:40. And the sages parse the phrases and terms in the verse. They learn different laws from the way that this verse is formulated in the Torah. In the phrase, and you shall take, the plural form of you is used, indicating that there should be taking in the hand of each and every individual, and no one can fulfill the obligation on somebody else's behalf. Everyone who is obligated in the mitzvah has to take his own lulav and esrog. As we learn, as we continue, and they continue to expound the verse, yourselves indicates from your own, to exclude a borrowed or a stolen lulav. And that's why we learned that if you don't have a lulav and you want to fulfill this obligation, so then your friend has to give you his lulav as a gift, and then you can gift it back to him after you take it and say the blessing. On the day, the phrase on the day comes to emphasize that there is a commandment by Torah law to take the lulav on each day of the festival, even on Shabbos. The word first, used with no qualification as to where the lulav is to be taken, indicates that this obligation is in effect everywhere on the first day, even in the outlying areas. And the first, with the definite article for emphasis, is restrictive, and it teaches that the mitzvah of taking the lulav overrides Shabbos only on the first day of the festival. So we're commanded to take the lulav and esrog every day of the festival, and on the first day it's a stronger commandment. It's clearly laid out in the Torah, and that's why we'll even override Shabbos. The rest of the days we will take the lulav and we'll say the blessing, but it won't override Shabbos, since the sages kind of derived the law of taking the lulav every day from the way that the verse was written in the Torah, but it wasn't explicit that you should take it except on the first day of the festival. And that's why it overrides Shabbos and the other days don't. We skip down a little bit to the B side of page 43. The Mishnah continues. The altar is encircled with the willow branch for 7 days. So now we're talking more about this ritual that we do on Hoshana Rabbah, the 7th day of Sukkot. When the temple stood, they would decorate the altar in the temple compound with willow branches, and they would circle it once, the priest would circle it once every day, and on the 7th day of Sukkot, they would circle it 7 times. So we're talking about that law. And then once the temple was destroyed, we took this practice, the sages took this practice and changed it into something that we do in the synagogues called Hoshanas, when we walk around the sanctuary every day of the festival. And on Hoshana Rabbah, we walk around it 7 times. So the Mishnah continues. The altar is encircled with the willow branch for 7 days. How so? If the 7th day of performing the mitzvah of the willow branch, the 7th day of Sukkot, occurs on Shabbos, right? So that would mean that the first day of Sukkot was on Sunday, and the 7th day is on Shabbos. Where am I? Since on that day, the mitzvah of the willow branch is a mitzvah by Torah law, it overrides Shabbos, and the mitzvah of the willow branch is then performed all 7 days of the festival, as opposed to if the 7th day is not on Shabbos, right? So then Shabbos happens sometime during the intermediate days. So these Hoshanas that we do, or that they did with the willow branch when the temple was standing, they wouldn't do it on Shabbos, right? They would, on that one day, they skipped it. And then they would do it, in a big way on the 7th day. But in other words, the ritual of the willow branch only happened on 6 days, not on 7, since they don't override Shabbos unless the 7th day of Sukkot falls on Shabbos. Same idea. And the Gemara asks, with regard to the mitzvah of the willow branch on the 7th day, what is the reason that it overrides Shabbos? And Rabbi Yochanan said, it is in order to publicize that it is a mitzvah that applies by Torah law, since it is not written explicitly in the Torah. So they're saying, even though it's not written explicitly in the Torah, it is a Torah law. It's not a rabbinic ordinance. And the Gemara raises an objection. Well, if so, Lulav also should override Shabbos in the temple on the other days of Sukkot as well, and not only on the first day, in order to publicize that it is a mitzvah by Torah law all 7 days, since that too is not written explicitly in the Torah, right? In the Torah it says, you shall take the Lulav on the first day of the festival. The rabbis, I guess, derive that you should do it every day, but it's still a Torah law. So I'm a little confused there. But with the willow branches, it doesn't say that at all, and they're saying, but it is a Torah law. So I think maybe the difference is that it was a Torah law given at Mount Sinai, or it's derived in a very strong way, and it's not something that they ordained that it should be in order to protect us from coming to violate other Torah laws, but rather, even though it's not written explicitly, it still is going to have the full force of an explicit Torah commandment. And the Gemara answers, one is prohibited from taking the Lulav on Shabbos by rabbinic decree due to the concern expressed by the sage Rabbah, which we read yesterday, lest he take the Lulav in his hand and go to an expert to learn how to wave the Lulav and thereby carry it in the public domain. The Gemara says, if so, with regard to the willow branch as well, let us issue a decree of the same concern. And the Gemara answers the two cases are different. With regard to the willow branch, agents of the court bring it to the priests who perform the mitzvah in the temple. And they carefully prepare the willow branch prior to the beginning of Shabbos, and they will not come to carry it in a prohibited manner. However, the performance of the mitzvah of Lulav is incumbent on every individual Jew in the nation. Therefore, there is a concern that one will unwittingly perform the prohibited labor of carrying on Shabbos. That the willows were only transported by experts in Jewish law, so they're not going to come to accidentally violate Shabbos. The Lulav is used by every individual, and they might easily come to violate Shabbos, and that's why they made that rabbinic ordinance, no doing it on Shabbos. And the Gemara objects, well, if so, i.e., because the willow branch is supplied by agents of the court and there is no concern that Shabbos will be desecrated, so let the mitzvah of the willow branch override Shabbos on every day of the festival as well. And the Gemara answers, in that case, people would come to raise doubts about the significance of the mitzvah of Lulav, as unlike the mitzvah of the willow branch, it would override Shabbos only on only one day of the festival and not on all 7. And the Gemara asks, meaning only on it only overrides Shabbos if the first day of the festival falls on Shabbos. And the Gemara asks, and let the mitzvah of the willow branch override Shabbos on the first day of the festival, just as the mitzvah of Lulav does, and not on the 7th day. The Gemara answers, the matter of publicizing among the people that the mitzvah of the willow branch is a mitzvah by Torah law would not be apparent in that case, as people would say that it is really the mitzvah of Lulav that overrides Shabbos, and once Lulav is permitted, the willow branch is permitted as well. So it's a little bit nuanced here, but basically you have to think that the sages are doing two things, right? They're interpreting the law in order to make sure that people don't come to violate the law unwittingly. And they're also aware that these laws are going to be promulgated among the Jewish people, and they're sort of thinking ahead as these decrees are heard by the Jewish people. How are they going to understand it, right? It's sort of like policy versus legal requirements. And the Gemara asks, and let the mitzvah of the willow branch override Shabbos on one of these other days of Sukkot. Why specifically the seventh day? And the Gemara answers, once you moved it from the first day, establish it on the seventh day, which is also a unique day of Sukkot and not on one of the intermediate days of Sukkot. And the Gemara asks, if so, if the mitzvah of the willow branch is so significant that it overrides Shabbos, let it override Shabbos today as well, even though the temple is not standing, now in the era after the temple was destroyed. And the Gemara asks, we do not know when precisely the month was established. So we don't know what the first day of the month was, so we're not sure exactly, did we hit the first day of Sukkot on the first day of Sukkot? Therefore, we're also uncertain when is the seventh day of Sukkot. Since we're uncertain if we got the date on the right day of the week, we're not going to override Shabbos outside of Jerusalem, outside of Israel, where it takes a longer time to get communication of when the month actually began. The Gemara asks, if so, with regard to the people of Israel who live in Israel and who know when the month was established, let them override Shabbos for the mitzvah of the willow branch on the seventh day of Sukkot, even today when the temple has been destroyed. When Bar-Hedja came from the land of Israel to Babylonia, he said, that is not a practical question, as the seventh day does not coincide with Shabbos. So now we're talking about when the sages fixed the calendar. And there's a note, and this is a law. When Hillel Hanasi, not the sage Hillel from the Second Temple period, but a much later Hillel, and his court established the fixed calendar, they ensured that Rosh Hashanah never coincided with Sunday, in order that the seventh day of Sukkot would not coincide with Shabbos. Right? So once they set up the calendar and it was no longer tied to witnesses seeing the moon and reporting, so they had a little bit of leeway how they were going to do it. And one of their rules in establishing the calendar for all time is that Rosh Hashanah would never fall on Sunday. I guess the first day of Rosh Hashanah would never fall on Sunday. And therefore, the seventh day of Sukkot would never fall on Shabbos. So it's a non-issue. That's what he's saying. It's a non-issue. When Ravin and all those emissaries who descended to Babylonia, or who originally left Babylonia for the land of Israel and then returned, when they came, they said, it does coincide with Shabbos, but it does not override Shabbos, right? That seventh day observance of the willows on the seventh day of Sukkot, it doesn't override Shabbos. And the Gemara asks, but it's ever really going to come up in practical terms? The Gemara asks, but then it is difficult. Why doesn't the mitzvah of the willow branch override Shabbos on the seventh day? And Rav Yosef said, who will say to us definitively that the mitzvah of the willow branch is performed by taking it? Perhaps it is performed by standing the branches upright against the altar. Since there is no altar today, the mitzvah does not override Shabbos. Today, what we do on Hoshana Rabbah is we will take bunches of willows and we'll do stuff with them, but it's just a remembrance of what was done in the temple time when they decorated the altar with those willow branches. So who is to say what you're really supposed to do with those willow branches? Was it decorating the altar, or was it lifting them up in the same way that we lift the Lulav and Esrog? Abaye raised an objection to Rav Yosef from the Mishna, and I'm almost done, so get your questions and comments in. Raised an objection to Rav Yosef from the Mishnah, which states, the Lulav is taken and the altar is encircled with the willow branch, either 6 or 7 days. What? Is it not learned from the juxtaposition of these mitzvahs in the Mishnah that the mitzvah of the willow branch is like the mitzvah of Lulav, in that just as the mitzvah of Lulav is performed by taking it, so too the mitzvah of the willow branch is performed by taking it, and not by standing it upright against something that reminds us of the altar, like the Aron, where the Torahs are stored. And he answered him, are the cases necessarily comparable? Perhaps this mitzvah of Lulav is as it is, by means of taking, that you lift it up, and this mitzvah of the willow branch is as it is, by means of standing it upright against a structure. Abaye raised an objection to Rav Yosef from a Mishnah. On every day, the people circle the altar 1 time, and on that day, the 7th day of the willow branch, they circle it 7 times. What, is the Mishnah not referring to circling the altar with the willow branch in their hands? And he answered him, no, it is referring to circling the altar with a lulav. The willow branches are on the altar, but the priests who are walking around it are holding the lulav in their hands. But didn't Abaye objects. But didn't Rav Nachman say that Rabba bar Avu said they would circle the altar with the willow branch? Rav Yosef said to him, he said to you, with the willow branch. However, my authority is no less than his, as we are both Amoraim, sages of the Talmud, and I say that they circle the altar with a lulav in their hands. It was stated that this was the subject of a dispute between other Amoraim as well. Rabbi Elazar says they circle the altar with a lulav. Rav Shmuel bar Nasan says, and Rabbi Hanina said they circle the altar with the willow branch. And likewise, Rav Nachman said that Rabbi bar Avu said they would circle the altar with the willow branch. Now, this idea that they circle once on the other days and then 7 times on the 7th day, some say that this practice was based on the conquest of the city of Jericho, where it too was circled once each day, and then on the 7th day they circled it 7 times, and that's when the walls of Jericho came tumbling down. What is the law about circling the altar? The halacha is, in the temple, when the temple stood, the people would circle the altar with the lulav. And they would also stand willow branches upright at the side of the altar, and they would take willow branches with the lulav in fulfilling the mitzvah of the 4 species as per the conclusion of the Gemara. Okay, that concludes our lesson for today. Let me go to comments and questions. Again, I apologize for the late start due to technical difficulties. I'm really glad we got it worked out. There was a moment there where I was afraid it wouldn't. Okay. Questions and comments. I did get the wording right. Thank you. So I said the correct bracha, right? So the first part where we bless God, rule the universe, and then say Asher Kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al netilas lulav, right? So who sanctifies us with his commandments and commands us concerning the taking of the lulav, right? So what's interesting about that is it's the same word as netilas yadayim, which we say when we wash our hands. Odd, right? Doesn't mean wash. It means we take our hands, right? So we take our hands in the water and clean them, but that's for another day. Okay, Hannah Steinbach. But they could have counted 29 days from the previous month. You're talking about the uncertainty in the outlying areas. So they wouldn't, but they wouldn't know whether the court had added 1 day to the previous month, and so the new month starts a day later, or whether they started the new month on the 30th day. Right now, it's a new month. There is no 30th day of the previous month, and since they couldn't be sure which day the new month had begun, that's a big deal because the laws of the first day of the festival are different than the laws of the intermediate days of the festivals. For example, in terms of whether we override Shabbos or not. Seraphim is saying to take is achaza, but yes, that's true. But there's different, we have synonyms here. But the bracha is al netilas lulav. Okay, Yosef, I think the Sephardic custom is to thrust the lulav in the 4 directions, but not to shake it. Is this an issue of minhag only? I guess there's different ways that do it. In fact, some people kind of wave it, but the waving, it kind of ends up waving, but really what you're doing is more of a thrust. I mean, you're right. It's like you're going like this, right, in that direction. Now, I think probably there's a difference. Some people will do that 3 times in each direction, and some people will just do it once. I'm not sure about that, and I'm sure there are differences of custom between different communities. And finally, Sharon, are the 7 hakafos of Simchas Torah derived from the 7 circlings of Hoshana Rabbah? Okay, so Simchas Torah is interesting. Simchas Torah is a later holiday, right? They didn't have that in ancient Israel. What they had was the 7 days of Sukkot, and then Shmini Atzeret is the 8th day of assembly. That's what they had. And then outside of Israel, they would have the 7 days of Sukkot, right? But the first 2 days would be a full festival. And then you get to Shmini Atzeret, and that would be a 2-day festival outside of Israel, right? Just like Shavuos is a 2-day festival outside of Israel and a 1-day festival in Israel. Then later, it became a thing to make a cycle of reading the Torah each year. And Simchas Torah was determined to be the starting point of that, right? That we would end reading the Torah for the year and begin the new cycle of reading the Torah. And it got attached to this holiday, which was attached to the 2nd day of Shmini Atzeret. So it would be like the 9th day of Sukkot, if you were counting that way. It's not, it's its own holiday. And in Israel, Simchas Torah and Shmini Atzeret are the same day, right? Now, in terms of the hakafos that we do, right, circling on Simchas Torah, we're circling around the bima where we read the Torah, we're celebrating, we're carrying the Torahs, we're dancing, it's amazing. Why those 7 hakafos? I mean, I'm guessing that at least some people would say that they're derived from the same source, right? The 7 circlings of Jericho might be the ultimate source both for the Hoshanas of Hoshana Rabbah and the hakafos of Simchas Torah. But I'm not sure. So if you learn more about that, let me know, Sharon. Okay, that's what I've got for us tonight. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow. I think I've got hopefully we won't have the technical difficulties tomorrow that we had today. And so we should be starting at the regular Friday time, which is noon Pacific. If possible, that's all I'm going to say. Noon Pacific tomorrow, Friday. Have a great night.